but I would say, if you look at the top 50 deep tech companies in India across these different segments, the technology is now developed, right? There's no tech risk per se. I think what is now required is just scaling up commercialization, right? So tens of crores to hundreds of crores and then thousands of crores of revenue. That's a scale up sort of challenge, right? You look at ethereal machines, tens of machines that are operating. They have customers who, anybody would love to have as customers. Now they need to go from tens of machines to hundreds of machines to thousands of machines. Log9 is another example, right? So they already have hundreds of crores of revenue. They're going very fast. So I think if you take the top 50 companies, I would say we're beyond technology risk, and they're all at various stages of commercialization.
Hi, wherever you're joining us, I hope you're doing well. Welcome to Tech Conversations, where I bring you insights from tech entrepreneurs, CXOs, and investors. I'm Hari Arakli, and in this episode, Rajan Anandan, a managing director at the venture capital firm Peak 15, talks about how India's deep tech ecosystem is today where the software as a service sector was 10 years ago. In this conversation, Rajan, who also leads Peak 15's Surge Accelerator program for early stage startups, talks about why there's never been a better time to start up in deep tech in India. So Rajan, thank you so much for making time for this conversation. We wanted to have this chat in the context of how you're backing deep tech companies in India. Maybe you could start us off right there. Give us a sense of why you started thinking about deep tech in India, some of the investments you've made, and also maybe if you will walk us through your philosophy when it comes to investing in deep tech. We'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. But firstly, thanks for having me. Excited to spend some time with you. Look, so I think deep tech really is in the context of what we do as Peak 15. As you know, we have 400 active portfolio companies. We've been investing in India for almost 20 years now, 9 billion under management. And look, our core focus really is to find extraordinary entrepreneurs, right, who are building businesses in what we think are large markets, right? And that's really the thing that we focus on. So in terms of what has changed, I'd say over the last, call it year and a half, maybe 2 years, is we have started seeing entrepreneurs who are building deep tech companies, right? Like we can't, as venture capitalists, we don't will it to happen, for deep tech to happen. We will invest in, extraordinary entrepreneurs if they're building companies that we think can become very large. The first, as Peak 15, and deep tech, we can also get into this, is quite broad, right? But we've been investing in AI companies for a long time. We'll talk about that. But if you set aside AI, I'd say the first sort of deep tech type company that we invested in was in 2019. It was a company called Log9. It's an advanced battery technology company. I'm sure you know about it. They were in our second cohort of Surge, which is our early stage seed investing platform. And then, we went probably for, so that was 19, maybe 2021, parts of 22, without making another investment, simply because we weren't seeing as many companies. But then really, I'd say probably about 18 months ago, maybe 24 months ago, I don't know the exact time frame, we just started seeing many more companies that were very interesting, that were focused on deep tech sectors, right? So I can't remember the second deep tech investment that we made, but I'd say over a period of about 18 months, we made 2 investments in semiconductors. We made an investment in battery recycling. We made an investment in green hydrogen. We made an investment in space. So literally, and we can talk more about that. We started investing in these spaces. Actually, the second company now I recall was Absolute, which is a biosciences company. So the first was advanced battery technology, and I think Absolute must have been in 2021. They were in our 5th cohort of Surge. Again, it was our seed platform, right? So, and then even after Absolute, there was probably about 18 months before we made the next investment. And then there was I'd say the last 18 months, we've been very active. And what has changed is, look, we just, now it could have also been, we started looking harder, but I doubt very much, because we have a pretty large team in India, and we're always looking for interesting companies. And we can talk about some of these companies, but each one of them is a very unique company with founders who have very deep domain expertise or deep technical expertise in what they're building. For instance, both our semiconductor companies come out of IIT Madras, which there's a phenomenal. I mean, as I'm sure you know, RISC-V was co-developed by Berkeley and IIT Madras, and one of these teams is called InCore. They're building basically a RISC-V core. The other one is a system-on-chip company. So each of these companies comes with is founded by a deeply technical team that has been working on it, interestingly, for many years. It's not, you can't sort of wake up one day and say, I'm going to launch a semiconductor company. And then second, they have very unique approaches that they're taking to the market. I think the other thing that's also happened is, let's take semiconductors for a minute. I'd say 4 years ago, India didn't have a mandate to try to promote a local ecosystem, right? So also the way we look at markets changed, and meaning all of a sudden you could see a large fabless semiconductor company being built in India, because India consumes we have about $30 billion worth of semiconductor being consumed a year. That number is going to go to 80 billion by the end of the decade, right? So if you get it right, you could build a multi-billion-dollar company. So a long answer to your question, but that's really what's happened. It's just we're just seeing many more very, very technical, highly capable founders starting up, trying to solve problems in very unique ways.
Can you talk about this a little bit more? You said 18 to 20 months back, you started seeing many more entrepreneurs looking to start deep tech companies in India. Any thoughts on what might have triggered that new wave?
Yeah, I don't know exactly a specific thing, right? But if you look at space, for instance, right? We have my partner Shailesh led an investment in a company called Digantara that you may know of. We can talk about that. But if you look at space, a decade ago, I think India had maybe one or two space tech startups. There was no space tech ecosystem in India at all, right? And in fact, Skyroot, I think, was founded in 2019 or so, before the space deregulation was announced by the government, right? So what happened in space, for instance, the big trigger point. Well, firstly, ISRO is the reason we have a space tech sector, right? For a long period of time, for many decades, you had talent that was trained at Cisco. You had world-class, sort of low-cost, affordable, infrastructure, launch capability, things like that were developed, underlying technologies that were developed there. So without ISRO, we wouldn't have a space tech sector. But I think what changed was deregulation, because all of a sudden now private sector in space was possible, right? And we had, if you look at the Skyroot founders, they came from ISRO. There were others who've kind of been either, we have some very young founders who are building in space, but they've been, interested in space. So I think if you look at this, you really have to have 3 or 4 things. You have to have talent that has, because especially in deep tech, you can't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to build a deep tech company, right? You have to, generally you've studied it for a long time, or you've been working in companies where you've been doing it for a long time. So you need to have that. I think second, you need to have a very favorable regulatory environment, right? Regulatory environment could be, it's a sector that's been deregulated. Space is an example. Or it's regulation like defense, for instance, right? We're beginning to see some very interesting, as India, some defense companies, defense tech companies, because the Indian government is now, much like many governments around the world, is saying, look, we want to buy, we don't want to be as reliant on defense tech from around the world. We want a local ecosystem that is very vibrant. That's a big change, right, in many, many sectors. Semiconductors, I think, is an example of that, right? So where it's really been 6-7 years where the Indian government has had a very significant focus on investing in talent and infrastructure. So for instance, without IIT Madras and the significant investments that IIT Madras has made into semiconductor infrastructure, right, where these 2 companies wouldn't have come out of there, because as startups, to go out and buy all the equipment that you need to do testing and things like that is just too expensive, right? So one is talent. I think second is infrastructure. Third, I think is really, I would say, maybe investments that started 10-15 years ago, just beginning to play out, right? C Camp in Bangalore. I don't know whether you're familiar with C Camp in Bangalore. I think it's founded maybe 10, 12, 13 years ago, right? The first, any time you start something new, it takes a gestation, especially in deep tech, takes 5, 7, 10 years. And then after that, you start seeing the fruits of what you're bearing. So I think that's really what started happening. But that being said, look, what I would say is it's still very early days. So the analogy I would make is let's take the SaaS ecosystem, right? The software as a, so IT services is now 35 years. We're about 35 years in. Infosys was founded in 1983, so maybe we are 40 years into IT services. With software as a service, SaaS, we are probably about 14 years in, right? Zoho was founded in 2004 or 5, the version of that we know today. But really, Freshworks was 2010. That was 14 years ago. And then up through, I think the first unicorn, SaaS unicorn in India was about 6 years ago. Today we have 23, and I think we'll end the decade at over 100 SaaS unicorns. So it takes a decade. So I would say today, if you ask me, where is deep tech relative to, let's say, a new space that emerged like SaaS, we are probably in that 2010 to 2012 or 13. We still have maybe 4, 5, 6 years to go before you're going to see prime time, meaning these companies really scale very fast. You have a large number of companies. Today, we have thousands of SaaS companies. Right now, of course, a lot of companies that are being started are AI companies. So I'd say those are the sets of things that have happened. All this stuff takes time, right? You can't wake up one day and say, how did semiconductors come about? The investments that have been made by the government for a long time, by academics for a long time, IIT Madras specifically for a long time.
And can you talk a bit about what you would consider as a deep tech company in India?
Look, so I mean, deep tech really is companies that are building whose innovations, right, are based on scientific advances and technology breakthroughs. Right? So I think deep tech definition really doesn't change from around the world. And in terms of how we as a firm define deep tech, AI is obviously, I'd say that's probably the biggest area of focus as an entire ecosystem globally for startups and venture capital. We can talk about that. But outside of AI, it's probably, I'd say, 6 or 7 sectors, right? Semiconductors we consider to be deep tech. Obviously, fabless semiconductors is where India is going to have a big play over the next X number of years. Second would be drones. Third would be space. Outside of AI. We think, by the way, climate has many sub-segments, climate tech, the EV ecosystem, and all the things tied to that. I think new energy, and we can talk about Nutrace. I think you're familiar with Nutrace. We can talk about that. That's an interesting example I want to talk about in terms of innovation and what can be deep tech and not, right? And then you get into areas like defense and so on and so forth. So it's a pretty broad range. Life sciences. So Absolute is basically a biosciences company, right? They've developed biopesticides, bioherbicides, biofertilizers, and so on. So that's the definition of deep tech. I think what we are looking for is a real innovation. So let me take either in a technology or in the science or in a process that is dramatically different, right? So we have we have a company called Metastable. They're based here in Bangalore. They have come up with an entirely new way of doing lithium-ion battery recycling, right? So the way they shred the batteries is different. The way they extract lithium and every other material in a battery is different, right? So no other company on planet Earth has the process that they're using to recycle lithium-ion batteries. So it is truly a 10x better approach to recycle lithium-ion batteries. Okay? So that is what we think is a 10x improvement on a process that is fundamentally different, right? So we file patents and so on and so forth. So that's one type of example. It's really tied to a process. I think another example I'd like to use is Nutrace, right? Which I think you know well. There are today green hydrogen electrolyzers. There are many companies in the world there aren't that many, but there are quite a number of companies that make green hydrogen electrolyzers. But electrolyzers have membranes in them. Right? And membranes have some complicated things around them because of rare earth materials and therefore supply chain risk and geopolitics and so on. The two co-founders of Nutrace, they're Indians who got their PhDs in Europe. They worked in Europe for many years, came back about 4 or 5 years ago, just before the pandemic. And they decided to build a new kind of electrolyzer that doesn't have membranes, right? There are only 2 other companies in the world that can make electrolyzers that don't have membranes. But the other 2 use different approaches. So they have come up with a different approach, for these green hydrogen electrolyzers. And we think today they can make it work at a small scale. They've implemented their first system at BPCL in Noida. But at scale, this technology could deliver better quality, if you can call it that, at much lower cost than any other electrolyzer in the world, right? So at the end of the day, what we look for is the outcome. What is the outcome that are technical? So for instance, with metastable, they can actually their capex is one fifth, their opex is one fifth of traditional lithium-ion battery recycling technology. Similarly, with new trace, you're looking at a significant improvement in performance. So these are sort of two examples. I don't know whether you've spent a lot of time at IIT Madras Research Park. I'm sure you have, right? The sensor lab of IIT Madras. I don't know whether you met the professors there. There are three of them. They're on their fourth company, right? So this is basically what happens at Stanford, right? Professors come out. Now, by the way, we have not invested in any of their companies yet. They basically take their research. Sometimes it's their PhD students who are working their research. They decide to commercialize their research, then the professors get involved. Some of these are actually the ideas that professors have. So I don't think, look, the US and China both have, probably the US has 40 or 50 years a lead on us when it comes to research in some of these areas. China maybe has 20 years a lead on us. But in many areas, we are as good, right? Like, so if you think about new trace, there are two other companies in the world that do this, which is quite remarkable, right? Actually, there is no green hydrogen electrolyzer company in the US today that comes even close on technology, right? And so that's what I mean by, so what we are seeing today is very, very, very interesting. And by the way, we wouldn't invest in a company if we didn't think, because when we evaluate a company, we're not looking at, is this special in an Indian context from a technology standpoint, right? Or the innovation in the process. We're trying to understand, is this really interesting globally? Because we don't want to invest in something that maybe is very differentiated in India, but there are like 50 other companies around the world that might be trying to do it. There's a company called Ethereal Machines. I don't know whether you're familiar with them. That's a very interesting example of an innovation in technology, deep tech company, but also innovation in a process, right? So CNC machines are very commonplace, but most CNC machines in the world are 3-axis. 5-axis CNC machines are required to make very high precision equipment components, right? Precision parts, if you will, that go into things like electronics, medical devices, space, and things like that, aviation. There are only less than 5 companies around the world that can make these 5-axis CNC machines. So this team at Ethereal Machines, they're based here in Bangalore, they spent about 7 years trying to build a machine. It's really hard to build one of these machines, right? So finally they built the machine. Now, are there other machines like that? Yes, but they're able to build those machines at a fraction of the cost of any other company in the world, right? So that's innovation number one. It took them 7 years to get there. But the second thing that is, they innovated on the business model. And I think that's very clever, because instead of selling the machines, what they're doing now is they're providing a service, right? So let's say you're a defense company, or you're a aviation company, or a medical device company, or you're a consumer electronics company. You can go to them and say, hey, can you guys make these parts that are very, very hard to do? They're very high precision. So those are a bunch of examples of the kinds of companies.
Can you put this in the context of nation building, if you will, in India? I mean, I know that you just said that you look at a company in terms of its global relevance. That said, now there's also much more awareness and understanding of why India needs to encourage deep tech. So can you talk about how the sum of all these different efforts is very, very important for India?
No, absolutely. Look, so by the way, we benchmark the technology globally to make sure that this is truly world-class, right? That's the reason but a lot of our deep tech companies, the initial market is going to be India. It's for the reasons we talked about, right? The economy is growing, there's deregulation, there's a national mandate to promote these sorts of technologies. Look, we think these are very, very critical. Let's just take semiconductors. It is absolutely critical that we are, over the next 20 years, it's going to take us 20 to 30 years to get there, right? Especially on the fab side. I think over the next decade, we'll make tremendous progress on SoCs and things like that, and cores. But in terms of actually getting world-class fabs here, it's a multi-decadal view, right? But certainly we need to, before the end of the decade, hopefully India will be the third largest economy in the world. We absolutely need to be self-reliant on semiconductors. It's going to take many decades. And I think it's absolutely critical, right? So that's one. Let's take Let's take a green, like clean energy, right? I think we're on track to get 50% of production capacity through solar, which is fantastic. But the reality is, if we really want to, and I actually think India will get to net zero well before 2070. Honorable Prime Minister, as you know, has put forward a 2070 date. I actually think we'll get there before that, because of the kind of innovations that we'll have in the hard to abate sectors, right? So green hydrogen is really helpful in hard to abate sectors, right? And there are many other innovations that'll come about. Let's take defense. India spends about $80 billion a year. That's our defense budget. I think about half of that goes to the forces, humans. There's tens of billions of dollars that are spent on equipment. I think it's very important that we are able to develop technology for defense and be, if not fully self-reliant, certainly, a large part of the way there. So in many strategic sectors, this becomes, I mean, look, there's no question that 30, 40 years from now, space, even by maybe the next decade, right? Space becomes a very, very important frontier for communications, for defense, and so on and so forth. Even before we try to colonize other planets, I think as India, we have probably other things to sort of focus on, because we already have 1.4 billion people on this planet. How do we make their lives better, right? So let's take agriculture. I mean, to feed 1.4 billion, our 1.4 billion population, as you know, is going to get to about 1.7 billion, right? The current projections are that they'll start peaking around the 2075, 2080. So to feed 1.7, 1.8 billion people, we're going to have to transform agriculture, right? And we think companies like Absolute are going to have to. We need dozens of, if not hundreds of companies like Absolute to be able to transform agriculture, right? Through inputs, through the right AI type products that we can use. What crop should you grow, when, which land, and so on and so forth. So I would say, look, to answer your question, it's absolutely critical for us to get each of these sectors right. Like, for instance, earlier this year, right, the government announced a quantum mission. Very, very important. Several thousands of crores, which was assigned to the quantum mission. So if you look at it today, India government has AI mission, 10,000 crores, very, very important. We have a semiconductor mission, absolutely strategic and very critical. We have a quantum mission. So at least those three, and I'm sure we have lots of other missions, but from a deep tech standpoint, those become very, very important. For instance, we have a very progressive drone policy, right? And many countries don't, by the way. So these things become very important for us.
So if we ask you to kind of strictly put on your VC investor's hat and look at both your portfolio companies, in general, the deep tech ecosystem, at this point of their maturity, on their way to becoming truly commercial entities, what might be their biggest challenges? And also, if there are any India-specific challenges, can you also talk about that?
Yeah, look, I think maybe it means just try to abstract a little bit away from our portfolio just to talk about the deep tech startups and what are the challenges that they face, right? And then we'll get into some of our companies. So the first big challenge is just technology risk, right? You're saying you can do this, but can you do it? Okay, what does that mean? Like, let's take one of our companies, Metastable, right? Their pilot factory is 5 tons a day. It'll be operational soon. The next step would be a 50-ton factory, right? Now, that we think is largely a scale-up. It's not technology, but Nutrace is trying to go from 100, is going to try to get to a megawatt system over the next, call it 3-4 months, right? So there's some technology, but not big technology, but there's some technology risk. So technology risk is one. I mean, all deep tech companies have some technology risk. Now, depending on the investor, you're familiar with the TRL, technology readiness levels, right? So some investors will invest at TRL 2 or 3 or 4, others will go at 6 or 7. So depending on at which stage you invest as an investor, you will take either more or less technology risk, but there is always technology risk when you think about a deep tech company. And that's not the case, as you know, right? So if you're building a fintech company, you don't really have technology risk, or you're building a digital first brand or an e-commerce company. So technology risk is one. I think the second is just look, what I call sort of scale up risk, because most of us venture capitalists in India, when we invest, we are either investing when something has come out of a lab into some sort of small production environment, right? At least our firm, we want to see something that is out of a lab, right? It's not just a researcher with a white coat on a lab. We want to see something, right? Like we want to see something, something that is built that seems to be working, right? Can they deliver what they just said? We don't need a big factory. That's after we invest, we go build a factory. But going from that small, let's call it outside the lab to a pilot factory, there's scale up risk. And then from a pilot factory, you got to go to a big factory, right? So when we invested, when we partnered with Nutrace, they had a 1 kilowatt system. Okay, that was 15 months ago. By October, November, they want to have a 1 megawatt system. That's a scale up risk. Now, part of it is technology, part of it is, okay, can they make such a big system, and so on and so forth. That's number two. I think third, you have a regulatory risk, right? For instance, in green hydrogen, there's a set of regulations that need to be passed so that the largest refineries in India decarbonize. Okay, if that doesn't happen, then the green hydrogen market in India won't happen as fast, and that's a regulatory. It's not a risk per se, but if that regulation isn't there, like for instance, if the government didn't have the Make in India imperative in defense, a lot of our defense companies, they wouldn't have the business because the country will probably would have continued buying from the other nations, right? So and I'd say the last one really is a market risk, right? And those things are sort of tied, especially in very futuristic markets. So let's take quantum, okay? Is quantum 2 years out, or is it 5 years out, or is it a decade out? We don't know. That's a market risk. Now, for the quantum market to happen, there has a bunch of technology breakthroughs that need to happen. So it is really technical risk, but it's also a market risk because these technologies need to come in place where quantum becomes a reality. So I would say those are the four major types of risk, and depending on the investor, you will want to take one or more of these risks. Right? If you're, let's say, a growth investor, you don't want to take technology risk for sure. You don't want to take, like, scale up, meaning, can you build a factory or not? You're sure you'll have a scale up company. So that's the execution risk is probably the last one, which is, hey, look, you're at, I don't know, 10 or 20 crores. Can you get to 200 crores and 2,000 crores? That is a pure execution game, right? Do you want to take regulatory risk? So depending on the sectors, do you want to take market timing risk, right? So depending on the investor, I think different investors have different approaches. Like, as I said, our approach is we will take some technology risk, but not a lot of technology risk. Meaning, if you're a scientist, if you're a researcher at IIT Bombay or Kharagpur or Kanpur or Madras, IIT Madras, and you've got something that you've invented, but it hasn't been shown to work yet, right? In a very small setting, that's probably not. We'll probably wait for that, right? If it's a sector that doesn't have a clear regulation, that's probably not something we want to do, right? Because we just don't want to take that sort of risk. So different firms invest at different stages. There are firms that will invest at TRL, technology readiness levels 2 or 3 or 4. There are others that will want to wait till 6 or 7, right? So long answer to your question, but that's sort of how we think about it. But it is certainly, deep tech, it certainly has a lot more risk than most other startup segments that you see, right? Fintech, consumer brands, e-commerce, sort of application software, like even AI, right? Application AI companies don't have the kind of risk that we're talking about, right? They don't have regulatory risk. They don't have these sorts of risks.
Do you find that entrepreneurs are coming to you where they have previously found investors who have invested in them at the TRL level 2, 3 stage? Because that's maybe one piece of micro evidence of how things are changing in India, if that is actually...
No, actually, so what, yeah, you absolutely, well, the thing that has really changed is the availability of grants, right? And infrastructure that offsets the need for capital, right? So for instance, both our semiconductor companies are great examples, both Mindgrove and Inco are great examples of this, right? If IIT Madras didn't exist, and didn't give them access to the kind of capabilities, infrastructure, grants, etc., that they needed, both those companies would have required 10x more capital. So I think this is really important, right? I think the grants that we have across many sectors, by the way, now, right, is absolutely critical. I think second, especially in deep tech, infrastructure becomes super important. Right, in AI, I think there's been a lot of discussion, and now with the AI mission, there's 10,000 crore AI mission. A large part of that is for compute. Right, compute is a is an infrastructure in the AI space, right? Like, can you get access to GPUs and things like that? So that becomes like, for instance, if you're trying to build a biotech company or a life sciences company, you got to have access to infrastructure. So BIRAC has played a huge role in both grants as well as infrastructure, right? So I think that's number two. And third, we have a few very, very good early stage deep tech, even earlier than us, right? Like, we are early stage because, we go very early. 30% of companies that we invest in at Surge haven't written a single line of code. Now, that is in software companies or software-centric companies. I'd say in deep tech companies, we probably, as I said, we want to see something that's working, right? Some basic thing that's working. So there are a few firms, but I would say this is an area that is going to require a lot more capital. A lot more capital from the government to go into infrastructure, into funding research, into grants. And also, I'm hoping that, as part of the deep tech policy that was announced, one aspect of it was a fund of fund for deep tech funds. That's going to be very, very important, right? So the 10,000 crore fund of funds that's being invested through SIDBI has played a huge role in promoting domestic venture capital firms. Now, that's not specifically allocated to deep tech. We think India needs something like that also for deep tech, so that we can really have many more funds that are deep tech focused. Because one, look, you need more patient capital. These companies do take longer to build. And second, it requires expertise.
Okay, I do want to ask you more about the policy and what you made of it, but just to stay on the thread of funding a little longer, on the growth funding side, can you talk about how things are changing in India today?
Yeah, I think the growth funding, there's a gap, right? It has changed. So, for instance, I think today, a lot of growth funding for deep tech companies is coming either from sovereign wealth funds. So if you look at the Skyroot rounds, GIC has led those rounds, right? GIC, Temasek, and so on and so forth. Or they come from strategics, right? Especially like, let's say, in climate technology companies, right? Like the big oil majors are very active and so on and so forth, or big energy companies rather. So I think that those companies have been active. I would say that mainstream growth capital from institutional investors, we have some ways to go. And I think that's, at least my view is, it's just a stage of maturity of the ecosystem. As the ecosystem gets mature, as we start seeing more successes, I think more growth investors will have the confidence to come and actually invest. But I would say the funding, especially institutional funding for deep tech at every stage, needs to be significantly improved. And before we get to growth, I mean, there's early stage, right? Early stage, there are very, very few funds that are active in deep tech today. We are very active. A few other firms are very active, but most firms are not. And then when you go to the growth stage, then that number reduces. But it's quite it is quite interesting that GIC, has led the growth rounds in India's most important, most advanced at this stage, right? Space tech company, which is very interesting, actually.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, GIC, Mayfield, some of these companies are, yeah. So on the deep tech policy, I'm sure you were among the central figures who were consulted on it. It looks like it's pretty comprehensive, but in actually implementing it, what might be some of the challenges? And is there anything that's missing or needs work in it that you'd say?
Look, firstly, it's an extremely important and very timely policy. So, and I think this broadly goes to, this government has been very, very good, right, about focusing on these things that are important and really going after it. So I think the policy is timely, it's very relevant, it is very comprehensive. You can't look at that policy and say, there are gaps in it. I think now it'll boil down to implementation, right? Like, let's take the IPR regime. How is the IPR regime going to change? I haven't seen anything yet on the specifics, right? Let's take the fund of funds for deep tech. I think the one thing that was announced, I don't know whether it's part of the deep tech policy or not. There was 1 lakh crore, right, for R&D that was announced. I just had a meeting on that. They're trying to figure out exactly how what that would go into. So I think with this, with the government now, with this next phase of the government, with the new government rather, hopefully we'll start seeing a lot more specifics on implementation each of those areas. But I have not seen yet the specifics on how is each of those things going to be implemented. But it's very, look, I think it's super critical. that we get it right.
This year, as the year progresses, it looks like uh, several companies are beginning to get to the point where they started to commercialize their technologies, whether it's Log9 or even Agnikul. Now they have a technology demonstrator in Bellatrix and Skyroot. What is your sense of, I don't know, over the next how many years will some of these companies have been done with, I would say, the first important phase of their product development, and a bigger proportion of their daily operations will be about commercialization?
Look, I think I don't know the exact number, but I would say, if you look at the top 50 deep tech companies in India across these different segments, the technology is now developed, right? There's no tech risk per se. I think what is now required is just scaling up commercialization, right? So let's take our own companies, right? Absolute, right? They have products, they have biopesticides, bioherbicides, fertilizers in the market, right? Farmers are buying them. Now we have to go from tens of crores to hundreds of crores and then thousands of crores of revenue. That's a scale up sort of challenge, right? You look at ethereal machines, they already have, tens of machines that are operating. They have customers who, anybody would love to have as customers. Now they need to go from tens of machines to hundreds of machines to thousands of machines, right? So I'd say like the top 50 companies, Log9 is another example, right? So they already have hundreds of crores of revenue. They're growing very fast. So I think if you take the top 50 companies, I would say we're beyond technology risk, and they're all at various stages of commercialization. And now it's about execution, commercialization, fundraising, which is a big challenge. So, for instance, like many of these companies will have to build factories, right? Look, simple thing like in Karnataka, getting approval for factories takes a really long time. So some of these things, some of these are state level topics can be solved. So I would say, look, I'm probably not as worried about the top. In the top 50, it's about execution, fundraising, traditional things that you have to do when you're trying to scale up a company. The thing that they will need help on is capital, because a bunch of these companies will require a lot of capital. But the thing is, we don't need just 50 companies, right? We need 5,000 companies. I'd say there you do have to address technology risk, regulatory risk, and so on, right? Like we should, I'm really excited about the quantum mission, right? India's quantum mission, 6,000 crores have been assigned. We really should, we need to have a shot. We need to have a shot at quantum, right? So some of these, like let's take telecom infrastructure, right? Government now is focused on 6G. I mean, we should really have a shot at 6G. So these sorts of things, I'd say, are probably more important to sort of put the foundations in place, have the next generation of entrepreneurs really come out and build. But this train has left the station, right? So the way I think about it is, it's like software as a service, 2010 to 2012. That's where we are. From there, it took about 6-7 years for it to really see liftoff. And 6 years ago, we had our first unicorn. Today, we have 23 SaaS unicorns. By 2030, we'll have 100 SaaS unicorns, right? So this is a multi-decade, more so than most other things, it's a multi-decade sort of journey that we're going to go through.
Your entire body of work over the last 3 decades makes you kind of a very global citizen, if you will. Can you talk about how the perception has changed in terms of whether, when you talk about a specific customer sitting in US somewhere, is there enough of recognition saying that, okay, if you build this robotic arm for me, I will buy it? Or, like you said, if there's the CNC machine now, sort of pioneering machining as a service out of Bengaluru, okay, I will confidently give you my work from the other side of the planet. How much people know about it?
Yeah, I think, look, so there we probably should separate AI from sort of, let's say, non-AI deep tech, right? So semiconductors, green hydrogen, recycling, batteries, things like that. I would say for outside of AI, most of our startups are focused on the Indian market because the market is large and the timing is now, right? So, there are some exceptions, like in space. I think the US government is now a little more open to space tech, etc. But that's a government to government sort of thing to start with, right? So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. I think that's a big change. Infosys, TCS, Wipro, HCL, Cognizant, they all got built on the US market, right? Virtually they had no revenue in India for a long period of time. The SaaS wave, which started again 13, 14 years ago, was almost entirely focused on the US. But interestingly, deep tech, and this is big change, there is a domestic market. Part of it is, India is now at $3.5 trillion GDP. The government, is really trying to promote a bunch of these sectors. So I would say very few of these companies are focused even on trying to sell to the US. So I can't answer your question because none of our companies are trying to outside of AI. I think in AI, there's absolutely a realization, right? The fastest growing, so if you look at AI, by the way, you have foundation model companies, you have infrastructure tooling companies, and you have application companies, right? India is seeing the most amount of innovation on the application layer in AI. And you have a company like NVIDIA, fastest growing prosumer AI app in the world. They went from 0 to 25 million of annual revenue run rate in 8 months. So they basically help YouTube creators make videos. It used to take them 3 or 4 hours. Now they can make it in 2 minutes, right? And they charge them $20 a month, something like that. So across verticals, across enterprises, there's a lot of respect for, Indian company shows up, has a great solution. We have a company called Arintra. It's an early stage company. They are focused on medical coding, right? So in US hospital system, let's say you do a procedure, your insurance, what is between the procedure and submission to insurance, you have to code it into the medical codes, and that's done today manually. Tens of billions of dollars are spent manually. So Arintra was founded by 2 Indians, got their PhDs in the US in AI, worked in the US for a while, came back a couple of years ago and started launching a company where they were in our last cohort of Surge. So they only sell to US hospitals. And very, very encouraging to see the receptivity. They've already got a bunch of large hospitals up and running. So I think, and by the way, for this, we should give credit to the IT services industry. Look, the reality is the largest Fortune 500 companies today are working with, IT services companies. Also, it helps that, we have 50, Indian origin CEOs of the Fortune 500. So I think in software today, anything to do with software, AI, there is not just an openness, but there's an excitement from US buyers to work with our companies. I think in deep tech, we just haven't seen it yet because our companies are very focused, right? So if you look at MindGrow, for instance, they were the first startup to do a tape out. Truly India designed semiconductor company. They were in a last cohort of Surge to do a tape out. They're focused, they're not trying to sell in the US, right? They're trying to sell in India and get the first many million chips we think can be sold in India. Similarly, Nutrace in green hydrogen, BPCL is their first customer. Their top 10 customers are all going to be Indian companies between public sector and private sector, Reliance, Adani, etc. That's a very large market, right? Ethereal is very interesting. Ethereal doesn't have any direct US companies, but some US consumer electronics companies that are global, that want to do things in India now are working with them. So, but again, there are a lot of their customers are Indian companies, and now increasingly sort of regional companies, if you will.
On the talent front, this is not like IT services, right? It's much more difficult to find the right people and then train them as well. Can you talk about how that's changing, and both with your experience with your portfolio companies and what you've seen in the ecosystem, how are founders addressing this challenge?
Look, but firstly, you have, if you want to have many more deep tech companies, you need to have founders with deep tech experience, right? I think the 2 things that we're seeing Indians with PhDs, with deep technical expertise coming back. Nutrace is a great example. They both came back from Europe. India now has many examples, but if you haven't talked to String Bio, they're not one of our portfolio companies, one of my favorite companies. You know Ezel, right? Okay. So she's a great example of coming back from Bay Area with a PhD and so on. So I think that's one dynamic, although it's a very small part of the broader picture. I think what you're seeing today is, look, I think this idea that if you're a scientist or you're a professor, you can start a company. That's changing, right? So as a result, I think you'll see more folks start up. That being said, look, we need to have 10x more investment into our PhD programs, right? We need to have a lot more focus on, like IIT Madras Research Park is a fantastic example of what needs to be done, but there is one. We need to have 20 IIT Madras Research Park type institutions, right? Like every IIT should have one. All the IISc is very, very interesting. We need to have more of that, I'd say. That's not because those sorts of that capability helps you commercialize research, right? One is you got to have the research. Second, you got to commercial. So that's at the founder level. And then I say when you go to sort of building out your team, right? Again, like we just need to over-index on higher education, especially PhD level talent. I have an interesting data point for you. In our last cohort of Surge, we had 13 companies. 8 of them had PhD founders, 8 out of 13. And actually, most of them, both founders were PhDs, if there were 2 founders, right? So, if you had asked me 2 years ago, would we have a Surge cohort where 70%, and by the way, that was a very unusual cohort too, because there are a lot of AI companies, deep tech companies, and so on. The next cohort won't be like that. It'll be slightly different because, we just partner with the best founders at any given point in time. But we do need to have, talent is an area where we need to invest. We need to invest a lot more. We need to both so that we can have more founders starting up, but also to build out these teams, right? Like you pick your favorite area of semiconductors, or semiconductors probably is an area where we do have enough talent because 20% of the designers globally are in India. Or they're sitting in all these large captive GCCs and things like that. So I think our companies are able to pull them out and get going. But take an area like quantum, right? So they have to come from academia. So we just need more investment in that.
Okay, I have heard you say previously that the decade of innovation for India is not this one, but the next decade. I just bring that up for context. And can you talk about how the deep tech playbook is evolving in the context of that future, and also give us a sense of how you envision Big 15's role in that?
By the way, I said that in the last decade. This is the decade. I don't know when I said that. I have not said that for 4 years.
I think it was in 2021 or 2022 in an interview with Harish, the former CMO of Mintra. I think that's where I heard it first.
That must have been before.
You may have mentioned it
before the
previously.
pandemic. Before the pandemic.
Okay.
No, by the way, this is the decade. Okay. This is the decade for Indian innovation. I'll give you some examples before we get to deep tech. 2015. If you looked at the top 100 countries on digital payments, India was not on the list. 2015, that was 8 years ago. Today, as you know, India is number 1 on digital payments. 48% of real-time global payments happens in India, right? If you look at any consumer commerce business, transactional, e-commerce, quick commerce, food delivery, we are world-class today. World-class. I don't know whether you know this, but quick commerce, right, this idea of 10-minute delivery, has not worked at scale in any other country, like none. It's working in India, right? Zomato just came out and said that the quick commerce business is either close to profitable or almost profitable, or whatever it is. So I would say in a bunch of these sectors that have been around for a while, right? Or where we've had radical innovations like payments, it was really about UPI, right? The India stack, the digital public infrastructure. We are world class today, right? And give you an example that a lot of people don't talk about. Mamaearth went from launch to IPO in 7 years. 14,000 crore market cap, profitable company with thousands of crores of revenue. There are so many examples of why I really do believe that the decade is now, but it's going to be a multi-decade play. I think in deep tech, as I said, it's very early, right? So if you had asked me in 2013 or 14, whether SaaS, the time for SaaS was now, I would have said no. But the SaaS then, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago really took off, right? Freshworks became the first unicorn, then very literally every year we would see lots of unicorns. So I think for the broader startup ecosystem, this is absolutely the right time. The time is now. I think with deep tech, the journey has started. And unlike some of these other sectors, be they fintech, be they consumer brands, be they commerce, be they even software, this one, I think, requires more intervention for the reasons we talked about, right? They take longer. You have to invest in basic research. Interesting data point, you know this obviously given what you do. If you look at R&D spending as a percentage of GDP, India is at 0.7%, China is at 2.5%, and the US is at 3.5%. Now, China's GDP is $16 trillion. So if you look at it on absolute dollar basis, they're outspending us, right? So if we say, look, we want to get to, let's just say 2%, okay, not 3.5% where the US is, by the end of the decade. So you take India's GDP by the end of the decade, and you say we want to go from 0.7% of GDP to 2%. That's a 10x increase in R&D. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of that has to come from private sector. India is, I don't know whether you know this, India is unusual where that 0.7%, 70% of that is actually government, 30% of it is private. So actually where India really lags is private sector R&D. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, as you know. So I would say with deep tech, the journey has started. I think the early signs are very, very encouraging. I think the nation is very focused on it. And I think now you're beginning, and by the way, we've always had the talent. So I think now the talent is being channeled in these, into these directions. And it's very, and look, our founders are now very, very bold. To say that, look, there are only 3 green hydrogen electrolyzer companies in the world that don't use membranes, and one of them is right here in Bangalore. I mean, that is really cool. When I was at Google, as you know, I was at Google for a long time. Every single day, somebody would ask me, who's the Google of India? Well, the Google of India is Google. But who's the Zomato of India? Zomato. It's not DoorDash. Here's another prediction, by the way. Zomato is at about 20 billion market cap. DoorDash is only at 40 billion market cap. We're at $2,500 per capita on GDP. Despite that, we're at, because, we have this huge headroom, right? So I think, my view is that, over the next 20 years, in every industry, the top 2 out of the top 5 and maybe 5 out of the top 10 companies will actually be Indian companies. Especially if they're academia or PhDs in science and deep science and deep technology. It's a great time to start up, right? Because I think our ecosystem is coming together. And by the way, if you're Indian origin academic anywhere in the world, or you're a scientist anywhere in the world, you should come back to India and start up, because we are very excited about what's going on here.